I still remember the first time my daughter-in-law asked me not to come out of my room when her friends came over for dinner. At first, she spoke gently, almost like she was making a polite request instead of giving an order. She stood in my doorway with her arms folded loosely, but her smile felt tight and practiced. "Margaret, could you do me a favor tonight?" she asked in a careful voice that sounded sweeter than it felt. I looked up from the sweater I was folding and waited for her to continue. "I have a few friends from work coming over for dinner tonight," she said, glancing down the hallway toward the living room. "They're all from the marketing firm, very professional people, and the evening might get a little loud." Then she hesitated for a moment, like she was choosing her words carefully. "So maybe it would be more comfortable if you stayed in your room tonight," she finished quietly. The word comfortable hung in the air like something fragile. I nodded slowly and said, "Of course, dear," even though something in my chest had already started to ache. At the time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal, and that young people liked their privacy when they entertained guests. I had lived long enough to understand that every generation did things a little differently. Ashley was only 32, full of ambition and eager to impress the people she worked with every day. I figured she just wanted the evening to go smoothly without worrying about an old woman wandering through the kitchen. So I folded the rest of my sweater, placed it carefully in the dresser, and closed the drawer quietly. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening to Ashley's footsteps fade down the hallway. A few minutes later, I heard cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen as she prepared for the night. The smell of roasted garlic and lemon drifted slowly through the air vents. Somewhere in the living room, Daniel was moving chairs around the dining table. The house buzzed with quiet preparation, like a stage being set before a play begins. I told myself again that this was normal, and that there was nothing to feel hurt about. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I am 72 years old. I raised my son Daniel almost entirely by myself after my husband died in a factory accident many years ago. Daniel was only 9 when the police knocked on our door that rainy afternoon. I remember standing in the doorway with a dish towel in my hand, while 2 officers explained what had happened. The words sounded distant and muffled, like they were speaking from the other end of a tunnel. When they left, Daniel came out of his bedroom and asked why the police had visited. I knelt down and held him close, trying to find words that would not break him. That night he cried himself to sleep while I sat beside his bed until morning. From that moment forward, everything I did was for him. Every shift I worked, every dollar I saved, every sacrifice I made had his future in mind. Being his mother became the center of my entire life. Back then, I worked long shifts at a diner downtown, where the coffee was always strong and the customers were always in a hurry. My feet ached most nights by the time I finished wiping the last table. Sometimes I worked 2 shifts in a row because the extra money helped keep the lights on. I learned to stretch every dollar in ways people rarely think about anymore. Some weeks dinner was nothing more than soup and toast, but Daniel never complained. He was a good boy with kind eyes and a soft heart. Teachers used to tell me he was polite and hard-working in class. When he brought home his report cards, he would place them carefully on the kitchen table like a small gift. I would hug him tightly and tell him how proud I was. Those moments made every exhausting day worth it. When Daniel graduated from college years later, I sat in the front row of the auditorium wearing my best blue dress. My hands trembled with pride as I watched him walk across the stage to receive his diploma. I remember whispering to the woman beside me, "That's my son," as tears slipped down my cheeks. All those late nights and tired mornings suddenly felt like they had meaning. I believed I had done my job well as a mother. Daniel hugged me tightly afterward and promised that one day he would take care of me the way I had taken care of him. I believed him because I had never known him to lie. Life moved forward in the quiet way it usually does. Daniel found a good job, bought a car, and started building a life of his own. For a long time, I watched his world grow bigger while mine slowly grew smaller. That is the natural rhythm of parenthood. Then Daniel met Ashley at a company holiday party. The first time he introduced us, she looked elegant and confident in a way that made me feel slightly invisible. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her smile looked like something out of a magazine advertisement. She shook my hand politely and told me she had heard so many wonderful things about me. I thanked her and tried to ignore the small distance in her eyes. Over the next year, Daniel talked about her constantly. He admired her ambition and the way she organized every part of her life. When they announced their engagement, I congratulated them both with genuine happiness. I wanted my son to have a partner who inspired him to grow. Their wedding was beautiful, full of flowers and soft music. I remember thinking that Daniel looked happier than I had ever seen him. A few years later, Daniel surprised me with an unexpected invitation. One afternoon, he arrived at my small apartment carrying 2 cups of coffee and a hopeful smile. "Mom, Ashley and I bought a house," he told me as he set the drinks on the table. I congratulated him immediately and asked where it was located. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. "There's plenty of space, and we want you to move in with us," he said gently. I stared at him for a moment because the idea had never crossed my mind. Living with my son again felt like stepping backward in time. But Daniel insisted it would make him feel better knowing I wasn't alone anymore. After a few weeks of thinking about it, I agreed. I packed my things carefully and moved into the spare bedroom in their large new house. For the first couple of months, everything seemed peaceful enough. Ashley remained polite, though our conversations rarely lasted longer than a few minutes. She was often busy with work calls, meetings, and social events. Daniel worked long hours as well, but he always asked how I was doing when we crossed paths in the kitchen. I tried my best to stay helpful without getting in the way. Some mornings I watered the garden and folded laundry before anyone else woke up. I cooked dinner occasionally when Ashley was working late. She always thanked me, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. I assumed we were simply learning how to share space with each other. Living together takes adjustment for anyone. I believed time would make things easier. Then came that first dinner party when Ashley asked me to stay in my room. As evening approached, the house slowly filled with the sounds of preparation. Plates clinked softly in the kitchen while music drifted through the living room speakers. Around 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang for the first time. I heard cheerful voices greeting Ashley at the front door. Laughter floated down the hallway like bright ribbons of sound. Someone complimented the house, and Ashley thanked them warmly. I sat quietly on my bed with a book open in my lap, though I hadn't read a single word. A few minutes later, another group arrived, bringing the scent of perfume and expensive wine. Their voices blended together in happy conversation. From my room, it sounded like a celebration I had not been invited to attend. At one point during the evening, I heard a woman's voice ask a simple question in the living room. "Ashley, do you and Daniel live here alone?" she asked casually. There was a brief pause before Ashley answered. I held my breath without realizing it. Then Ashley laughed lightly, the kind of laugh people use when they want to appear relaxed. "Yes, it's just the 2 of us," she replied. My fingers tightened slowly around the edge of the book in my lap. In that moment, something shifted quietly inside my heart, because the truth was only one hallway away behind a closed door. I realized then that Ashley wasn't just asking me to stay in my room. She was pretending I didn't exist at all. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, even though my body felt tired and heavy. Sleep had come in pieces during the night, and each time I closed my eyes, the memory of that evening returned like a quiet storm. I tried to convince myself that perhaps I had misunderstood something, that maybe Sarah was only nervous about hosting her friends and didn't want any interruptions. But deep inside, I knew the truth was simpler and colder than that. She had hidden me because she was embarrassed of me. I walked slowly into the kitchen and began making tea, the same way I had done every morning for decades. The gentle sound of the kettle boiling filled the silence of the house. For a moment, I wondered if anyone else in the house felt the heaviness that sat quietly on my chest. When Sarah walked in, she greeted me politely, almost as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. Her voice was calm, her smile polite, and her eyes carefully avoided meeting mine. That polite normalcy somehow hurt more than any argument ever could. I poured tea into 2 cups and offered one to her, and she thanked me with a quick nod. For a few minutes we sat in silence at the kitchen table, the ticking of the clock sounding louder than usual. I studied her face carefully, trying to see if there was even a hint of discomfort in her expression. But Sarah was good at appearing composed, and she stirred her tea slowly as if everything in the house was perfectly ordinary. Finally, she cleared her throat and spoke in a soft voice that sounded almost rehearsed. She said her friends had really enjoyed the dinner and that they had complimented the food many times. I nodded politely, even though I had prepared most of those dishes myself earlier in the day. She continued talking about how important it was for her to maintain a certain image with the people she worked with. Her words were gentle, but the meaning behind them slowly unfolded like a painful truth. Without saying it directly, she was explaining why I had needed to stay upstairs. At that moment, my son Daniel walked into the kitchen, stretching his arms and yawning like someone who'd slept peacefully. He smiled when he saw us sitting there and kissed Sarah on the cheek before pouring himself a cup of coffee. For a second, I waited for him to say something about the previous evening, or even ask how I was doing. But Daniel seemed completely unaware that anything unusual had happened at all. He spoke cheerfully about work, about a meeting he had later that day, and about how nice it had been to see Sarah enjoying herself with her friends. I watched him carefully, searching for any sign that he knew I had been hidden away in my room. The realization slowly settled in my heart that he truly had no idea. Sarah glanced at him briefly, then quickly looked back down at her cup. Something in that brief look told me she had never mentioned it to him. And in that quiet moment, I realized I was the only one carrying the weight of the night before. After Daniel left for work, the house returned to its usual silence. Sarah began cleaning the kitchen, moving quickly as if she had many things on her mind. I stood up slowly and offered to help wash the dishes, but she gently insisted that I didn't need to. Her tone was polite, almost overly polite, and it created a strange distance between us. I decided not to argue and instead walked to the living room, where sunlight was slowly filling the space through the large windows. Sitting on the couch, I looked around the room that had once felt so warm and welcoming to me. When Daniel first invited me to live with them after my husband passed away, he had promised I would always have a place in their home. At the time, those words had brought me comfort during one of the hardest seasons of my life. I had believed that living together would bring our family even closer. Yet now the house felt different, as if invisible walls had quietly appeared overnight. I wondered how something so subtle could change the feeling of an entire home. As the day passed, I tried to focus on small tasks around the house to keep my mind busy. I watered the plants in the garden, folded laundry, and prepared a simple lunch. Every movement felt slower than usual, because my thoughts kept drifting back to the same painful question. Had Sarah always felt embarrassed by me, or was this something new that had grown quietly over time? I replayed different memories in my mind, searching for moments when she might have shown similar feelings. There were small signs I had ignored before, tiny comments about how I dressed or how I spoke to guests. At the time I had laughed them off, assuming she was only joking or being playful. But now those memories seemed to carry a different meaning. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive loudly with a dramatic moment. Instead, it reveals itself slowly through the quiet connections between small events. And when you finally see it clearly, it can change how you understand everything that came before. Later that afternoon, Sarah left the house to run errands, and I found myself alone with my thoughts again. The quiet gave me time to reflect on the years I had spent raising Daniel. I remembered the nights when he had been sick, and I stayed awake beside his bed, gently wiping his forehead. I remembered working extra hours when money was tight, determined to give him opportunities I never had. Every sacrifice had felt worthwhile because watching him grow into a kind and responsible man had filled my heart with pride. I had never expected anything grand in return, only the simple comfort of knowing I still belonged in his life. Yet belonging can be a fragile thing when circumstances change. Marriage brings new priorities, new loyalties, and sometimes new distances that no one openly discusses. I wasn't angry with Daniel for building a life with his wife. What hurt was the quiet feeling that somewhere along the way, my place in that life had become smaller. When evening arrived, Daniel came home from work with his usual cheerful energy. He greeted me warmly and asked how my day had been, completely unaware of the storm quietly moving through my thoughts. I answered with a gentle smile, telling him everything had been peaceful and ordinary. Part of me wanted to tell him about the dinner and the reason I had been upstairs all evening. But another part of me hesitated, unsure whether speaking up would change anything at all. Sometimes revealing a painful truth can create more distance rather than bringing understanding. So I remained silent and listened as he spoke about his day, about office conversations and future plans. Sarah joined us a few minutes later, and together they talked comfortably as if the house was perfectly balanced. Watching them laugh together reminded me how much they loved each other. And strangely, that love made my decision to stay quiet feel even more complicated. That night, as I prepared to go to bed, I paused for a moment in the hallway outside my room. The house was calm and peaceful, the way homes usually appear from the outside. But inside my heart, something had shifted in a way I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't only about being hidden from Sarah's friends the night before. It was about the quiet realization that my presence in this house depended on how comfortable it made others feel. For the first time since moving in, I wondered whether my staying here was truly welcome. The thought was not dramatic or angry, just quietly honest. Life has a way of presenting small moments that force us to reevaluate where we stand. And sometimes those moments arrive without warning during the most ordinary evenings. As I closed the door to my room, I knew that the story of this house had begun to change in ways none of us yet understood. The following morning began quietly, but the heaviness from the past 2 days still lingered inside me. I woke before sunrise and sat beside the window in my room, watching the pale light slowly spread across the neighborhood. The world outside looked peaceful and unchanged, yet something inside me felt different now. For the first time since moving into Daniel's home, I felt like a visitor rather than a member of the household. It was not that anyone had told me to leave or spoken harshly to me. In fact, both Daniel and Sarah continued to behave politely and respectfully in every conversation. But sometimes politeness can create a colder distance than honesty ever could. The memory of being asked to stay upstairs while guests filled the house had quietly shifted something in my heart. I found myself wondering whether that moment had simply revealed a truth that had been present all along. And once a truth is seen clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore it again. When I walked into the kitchen later that morning, Sarah was already there preparing breakfast. The smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee filled the room, and she greeted me with the same calm smile she always used. For a moment, I studied her face carefully, wondering whether she ever thought about the previous evening the same way I did. If she did, she showed no sign of it in her expression or her tone. She asked if I had slept well and told me she had a busy schedule planned for the day. Her voice was friendly, almost warm, and anyone listening would assume we shared a comfortable relationship. I answered politely and thanked her for the breakfast she had prepared. Yet beneath those ordinary words there was a quiet awareness between us that neither of us mentioned. It was the kind of unspoken understanding that exists when two people know a delicate subject is being carefully avoided. And in that silence, the distance between us quietly remained. After Daniel left for work, Sarah gathered her purse and prepared to leave as well. Before walking out the door, she paused for a moment and turned toward me with a thoughtful expression. She said she hoped I hadn't felt uncomfortable the night her friends visited. The question was spoken casually, but it carried a deeper meaning hidden inside it. I hesitated for a moment before answering, choosing my words carefully. I told her that I understood she wanted her evening to go smoothly, and that I didn't want to cause any interruptions. She nodded slowly, looking relieved that I had responded calmly instead of questioning her decision. Then she thanked me for being understanding and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. I remained standing in the quiet living room long after she left. Her brief question had confirmed something important to me. She knew exactly how that evening might have made me feel. For the rest of the day, I tried to keep myself occupied with small activities around the house. I sorted old photographs, cleaned the bookshelf in the living room, and prepared a simple lunch. Each task gave me something to focus on, yet my thoughts continued drifting back to the same quiet realization. Sarah had not hidden me because of a sudden moment of embarrassment. She had hidden me because she believed it was the easiest way to maintain the image she wanted in front of her friends. Understanding that truth helped me see the situation more clearly. It wasn't about anger or cruelty, but about priorities. In her world, appearances mattered deeply, and anything that threatened that image was carefully managed. Unfortunately, that included me. Recognizing this didn't fill me with bitterness, but it did change the way I looked at the house around me. I began to see it not only as Daniel's home, but as a space shaped primarily by Sarah's comfort. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me from work just to check in. His voice sounded cheerful and relaxed, and he asked if I needed anything from the store on his way home. I told him everything was fine and asked about his day instead. Listening to him speak so casually reminded me of the years when our conversations had been simple and open. Back then, he would tell me everything, from small problems at school to dreams about his future. Even now he still spoke with kindness, but there were pieces of his life I no longer saw clearly. Marriage had created a new center in his world, and naturally his attention revolved around it. I understood that change and never wanted to interfere with it. Still, hearing his warm voice made me realize how much I valued the connection we still shared. That bond had carried us through many difficult years together. I hoped it was strong enough to survive the quiet tension now growing in the house. When evening arrived, Sarah returned home first and began preparing dinner. I offered to help chop vegetables, and she accepted the offer with a polite smile. For a while we worked side by side in the kitchen without speaking much. The rhythmic sounds of cutting boards and simmering pots filled the space between us. Finally, she began telling me about her day at work and the projects she was managing with her colleagues. I listened carefully, asking a few questions so she knew I was interested. Gradually, the conversation became more relaxed, and for a moment it almost felt like the comfortable atmosphere we once shared. But then she mentioned another gathering she planned to host the following month. As she spoke, I noticed her tone become slightly cautious again. She explained that many of her professional contacts would attend and that it was important for everything to appear organized and elegant. I understood the meaning behind her careful explanation without her needing to say it directly. Daniel arrived home shortly after dinner was ready, bringing his usual lively energy with him. He greeted both of us warmly and began telling a humorous story from his office that made Sarah laugh. Watching them together, I felt a mixture of affection and quiet distance at the same time. They looked happy and comfortable in the life they were building together. That happiness mattered to me more than anything else. Yet a small part of me wondered whether there was still space for me within that life. The evening passed peacefully as we shared dinner and talked about everyday topics. No one mentioned the dinner party from before, and no one questioned the gentle tension that occasionally surfaced between Sarah and me. By the time we finished washing the dishes, the house had settled into its usual calm rhythm. From the outside, everything appeared perfectly normal. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something important about the past few days. Life rarely changes with loud confrontations or dramatic decisions. More often, it shifts quietly through small moments that gradually reshape our understanding of where we belong. Being hidden upstairs during that dinner had been one of those moments for me. It had not been a loud rejection, but it had revealed something about how Sarah saw me in her carefully arranged world. Now that I understood that perspective, I knew I would need to decide how to respond to it. The future of my place in this home would depend on the choices I made next. And although I didn't yet know what those choices would be, I could feel that a turning point was slowly approaching. The next morning, I woke to the quiet hum of the house. Daniel had already left for work, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, painting the room with a gentle warmth that contrasted sharply with the heaviness in my chest. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it to the porch, letting the steam curl slowly around me. The air smelled faintly of dew and freshly cut grass, the kind of simple scent that often reminds you life can still hold moments of peace even amid tension. I thought about the previous evening, the way Sarah had carefully guided me upstairs, the way I had obeyed quietly, and the way Daniel had seemed unaware or unwilling to intervene. It wasn't cruelty, I told myself, but calculation. And perhaps in that calculation lay a lesson I needed to understand before I made my next move. I spent the morning reflecting on the patterns I had begun to notice in my daughter-in-law. Sarah had always been meticulous, precise, and protective of her image, but this was the first time her careful attention had directly affected me. I realized that for all her warmth and smiles, there was a boundary she considered unbreakable. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was clear. Her world and mine, though connected by Daniel, operated on slightly different planes. I thought about my own actions over the years I had devoted to raising Daniel, ensuring he grew up with stability, and maintaining my home with dedication. I had never asked for special treatment, only for respect and acknowledgement. But respect sometimes had to be asserted, and I knew I couldn't passively accept this silent exclusion without losing more than a simple meal or a pleasant evening together. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling both resolve and the weight of years pressing on me. Sarah returned mid-morning with a quick smile, carrying her laptop and a stack of papers. She paused when she saw me on the porch, and I returned her glance evenly. There was no accusation, no embarrassment, only a small hint of awareness in her eyes. "Morning," she said, placing her things on the counter. I replied with a simple greeting, and for a few moments silence hung between us. Then she asked if I wanted to help her organize the living room shelves, explaining that some of her work-related books needed proper placement. I agreed, using the task as both a distraction and a subtle measure of engagement. As we worked side by side, I observed her carefully. She moved with precision, choosing where to place each item, straightening every corner and edge. I began to understand that her meticulousness was part of how she managed anxiety and control. Yet it also became apparent that her management style sometimes left little room for anyone else's presence, even mine. By late afternoon, Daniel returned home with his usual cheerful energy. He greeted both of us warmly, carrying a small bag of groceries. He unpacked them, chatting casually about his day, and I noticed again the effortless connection between him and Sarah. It reminded me of the years when I had been his center, the one who listened to every worry and celebrated every triumph. That center had shifted naturally with his marriage, and I could feel the subtle ache of displacement. But I also recognized a new opportunity. While my role had changed, it hadn't disappeared entirely. There were still ways to remain present and significant in Daniel's life and within the household. I decided that I would find those ways carefully, without confrontation or bitterness, but with the quiet clarity that came from experience and observation. I resolved to act with patience, knowing that true understanding often emerged gradually. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, with Sarah preparing the food and Daniel casually recounting a humorous story from work. I participated in the conversation, offering small remarks and questions, but I was also observing. I noticed subtle glances exchanged between Daniel and Sarah, small gestures of affection, and moments where Sarah's attention shifted between efficiency and warmth. It became clear that she measured everything carefully, balancing her sense of propriety with her desire for connection. I considered how I could navigate this balance. I didn't need to confront Sarah directly about her actions. Doing so could provoke defensiveness. Instead, I would seek a presence in the house that was neither disruptive nor invisible, a way to remain significant while respecting her boundaries. After dinner, I retreated to my room to reflect further. I retrieved a small notebook from my bedside table and began writing down observations and ideas. I noted the way Sarah controlled the home environment, the way Daniel navigated between us, and the ways I could assert my own presence without conflict. Writing gave me clarity. It allowed me to transform quiet frustration into strategic thought, channeling emotion into planning rather than resentment. I realized that this approach mirrored lessons I had learned over decades of managing family and household dynamics. Life often demanded patience and subtlety, especially when emotions were involved. By observing and recording, I could develop a clear plan to maintain my dignity, my relevance, and my sense of belonging. That night, sleep came slowly. I lay awake, thinking about the previous dinner and what it revealed about family dynamics. Sarah's careful curation of appearances had exposed something deeper: how easily proximity could be controlled and how invisible one could become if careful measures were taken. Yet, even in this realization, I felt no anger, only determination. I understood now that my role within this home would not be assumed automatically. It would need to be negotiated with patience, observation, and subtle assertion. I resolved to engage with the family thoughtfully, choosing my moments and interactions to cultivate presence, understanding, and influence. This wasn't about confrontation or revenge. It was about claiming space in a world that had quietly shifted around me. The following days passed in a similar rhythm. I continued to assist with household chores, participate in casual conversations, and observe the interactions between Daniel and Sarah. Each day revealed small insights: the way Sarah prioritized efficiency over warmth in certain situations, the subtle adjustments she made when guests were expected, and the moments where Daniel unconsciously mediated between us. These insights became valuable. I began to see patterns and opportunities for engagement, moments where my presence could be meaningful without being intrusive. Slowly, I started to feel more confident navigating the household. I was no longer just a visitor. I was learning to occupy a thoughtful and deliberate position in the life of my son and his family. One evening, Sarah announced that she would host a small work dinner the following week. She spoke with the same meticulous attention to detail as before, explaining how she wanted the space to appear and the menu to be arranged. I remained quiet, listening carefully, and chose my words with care. I expressed my willingness to assist in any way that would be helpful. Sarah nodded appreciatively, perhaps sensing my sincere intent. Later, when Daniel and I were alone, he mentioned the dinner casually, unaware of the quiet strategies and reflections I had been cultivating. I smiled, realizing that while appearances remained under Sarah's control, I was quietly regaining agency within the home. This was a subtle victory, but one that felt deeply satisfying. By the end of the week, I had developed a clear sense of how to navigate the household dynamics. I understood the importance of patience, observation, and deliberate engagement. I realized that my presence could be both supportive and influential without challenging Sarah overtly. The delicate balance between respect and assertion became my guiding principle. I began planning small actions, simple gestures that would demonstrate my value, kindness, and insight to the household without threatening the carefully constructed environment Sarah maintained. Each thoughtful action became a stepping stone, slowly rebuilding my position within the family and reinforcing the quiet strength I had always carried within me. I ended the week reflecting on how easily life can shift, often through subtle moments rather than dramatic gestures. Being hidden during Sarah's dinner had revealed not only her priorities but also my own capacity for patience and strategic engagement. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that influence and respect were cultivated through careful thought, consistent action, and the quiet assertion of presence. And in that understanding, I found a deep sense of peace, knowing that while the household dynamics had changed, my role and significance could be carefully reclaimed with wisdom, patience, and the gentle force of experience. Even though the dinner was still a few days away, I began preparing quietly, making small adjustments to my routine that would allow me to be fully present when the moment came. I cleaned the guest room, straightened the cushions in the living area, and even polished the silverware, all under the guise of simple household upkeep. But each action carried a hidden purpose. I wanted to demonstrate value without overtly asserting myself. In subtle ways, I began to weave myself back into the rhythms of the house, so that when the dinner arrived, my presence would feel natural rather than intrusive. I wasn't planning confrontation, nor was I seeking revenge. I wanted acknowledgement, space, and respect, the same things I had given my family all these years without complaint. Sarah moved about the kitchen that afternoon, tasting sauces and adjusting seasoning, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. I watched quietly from the doorway, noting the way she worked, the small signs of stress hidden beneath her calm exterior. I realized that her meticulousness was both armor and routine, a way to maintain control in a world where she often felt responsibility stretched thin. Understanding this gave me a sense of power, not over her, but over my own reaction. I could choose how to engage, when to speak, and how to assert myself without conflict. I sipped my tea slowly, appreciating the opportunity to observe and plan. Each detail mattered: the placement of chairs, the arrangement of dishes, even the way silverware reflected the light. I began to see the dinner not as a trap, but as a stage where subtle influence could take root. The day of the dinner arrived with a mix of anticipation and careful composure. I dressed modestly but neatly, selecting a soft pastel blouse that conveyed warmth without drawing excessive attention. My hair was tied back simply, and I wore no jewelry beyond my wedding ring, a symbol of continuity and presence. As I moved through the house, I observed every detail, ensuring that rooms were in order, surfaces clean, and the overall ambiance welcoming. I found satisfaction in these preparations, knowing that small acts of thoughtfulness could shift perceptions in ways larger gestures often could not. I wasn't trying to outshine Sarah, nor was I seeking approval. I was asserting my dignity quietly, creating a space for myself in a situation designed to exclude me. Guests arrived in a steady trickle, each greeted by Sarah with a smile and careful words. I stayed mostly in the background, offering polite nods and soft greetings, allowing Sarah to shine while remaining present. It was a delicate balance: enough visibility to remind Daniel and the guests of my presence, yet restrained enough not to draw criticism or discomfort from Sarah. I noticed subtle glances exchanged between Sarah and Daniel, small reassurances and signals that spoke volumes about household hierarchy and relationships. In these moments, I recognized that my influence could be felt without speaking loudly. Every action, every gesture, was a measured assertion of dignity and quiet strength. I was no longer hidden, but I was also not competing. I was simply present, visible, and aware. As the evening progressed, conversation flowed with ease. Daniel laughed at a shared joke, and I contributed small remarks that elicited smiles without dominating attention. The guests seemed unaware of the undercurrents running beneath the polite conversation, and Sarah moved gracefully between tasks, serving drinks and plates with practiced efficiency. I marveled at her composure, realizing how much effort it must take to maintain such a controlled atmosphere. Yet, I also saw moments where her eyes flickered toward me, brief, subtle acknowledgments of my presence, the silent recognition of a household member she could not completely manage or exclude. It was in these small moments that I felt the first real shift, the awareness that invisibility was no longer absolute. Later, when the guests were seated and conversation lulled briefly, I found a quiet moment to speak to Daniel privately. I commended him on the meal and the welcoming atmosphere, subtly reinforcing my appreciation for his role in creating harmony. He nodded, smiling, clearly comfortable with my presence yet unaware of the deeper observations I had made about Sarah's careful orchestration. This exchange was brief, but it carried weight, a reminder that my relationship with Daniel remained strong, grounded in years of shared experience, mutual care, and understanding. I realized that my subtle influence in the household was no longer hypothetical. It was emerging in tangible ways through quiet observation, measured engagement, and consistent presence. As the evening wound down, Sarah began clearing plates and arranging the kitchen with the same meticulous attention as before. I assisted where appropriate, placing utensils in the dishwasher and wiping counters, contributing in ways that were helpful but unobtrusive. The guests remained engaged in conversation, largely unaware of the subtle dynamics at play. I recognized that my approach, measured, patient, and deliberate, was beginning to yield results. My presence was acknowledged without direct confrontation, and Sarah's control, while intact, was no longer absolute. I felt a sense of satisfaction, not in triumph, but in the quiet assertion of dignity and influence. It was a lesson in subtlety sometimes. The most profound victories are those that go unnoticed by the world, yet fundamentally shift the balance of relationships. Once the guests departed, the house returned to its familiar quiet. I and Sarah moved through the cleanup together, our interactions polite yet tinged with mutual recognition. I noticed small changes in her demeanor, moments of ease where she seemed less guarded, brief smiles exchanged that felt genuine. I realized that while the dinner had been orchestrated under her terms, my quiet engagement had subtly shifted the atmosphere. I did not overstate my presence, nor did I assert control, but the balance had begun to adjust in ways that were noticeable, if not overtly acknowledged. I found this deeply satisfying, understanding that influence could be cultivated through patience, observation, and thoughtful action rather than confrontation. That night, I retired to my room reflecting on the day's events. I opened my notebook and recorded observations, noting the way Sarah had managed her guests, the small acknowledgements of my presence, and the opportunities I had identified for further engagement. Writing gave clarity, transforming the complex emotions of the day into structured understanding. I reviewed each interaction, considering how subtle adjustments could create space for meaningful presence without provoking defensiveness. This reflection reinforced my belief in the power of patience, strategy, and careful observation. Influence, I realized, often manifests quietly, with results that accumulate over time rather than in dramatic gestures. The following days continued with a delicate rhythm. I engaged in household tasks, participated in casual conversation, and maintained consistent observation of family dynamics. Each interaction became a subtle test: how Sarah managed tasks, how Daniel navigated between us, and how I could assert presence without intrusion. I realized that these small adjustments, thoughtful actions, careful words, and consistent engagement were beginning to reshape perceptions within the home. I no longer felt hidden or excluded. Instead, I sensed the gradual emergence of acknowledgement, respect, and subtle influence. It was a quiet reclamation of space, conducted with patience and intelligence, reflecting the depth of experience I had accumulated over decades. By midweek, I noticed tangible signs of change. Sarah's careful orchestration was still evident, but moments of genuine warmth and acknowledgement toward me had begun to surface. Daniel's attentiveness was more pronounced, subtly ensuring that I was engaged and comfortable. I realized that the cumulative effect of my subtle actions was beginning to yield results. My presence, once minimized, was now an accepted and even welcomed part of the household dynamic. This understanding filled me with quiet satisfaction, a recognition that influence is often built incrementally, with observation, patience, and strategic engagement. It was a reminder that respect and acknowledgement are cultivated, not demanded. As the week came to a close, I prepared a small gesture for Sarah, freshly baked muffins placed on the kitchen counter with a polite note expressing appreciation for her hosting efforts. It was a simple act, unassuming in appearance, yet loaded with intention, a reinforcement of presence, acknowledgement, and goodwill. Sarah noticed, her eyes briefly widening in surprise before softening into a smile. It was a small victory, not for control, but for mutual recognition and the establishment of a subtle but meaningful connection. I realized that through consistent, thoughtful action, I had begun to redefine my position within the household, creating space for dignity, respect, and quiet influence without confrontation. The weekend arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation, though I didn't share it openly. I continued my routine with measured care, ensuring that every corner of the house reflected the warmth and attention that had defined my presence for decades. I baked bread in the early morning, letting the scent drift through the house, a subtle reminder of the comfort and care I brought without fanfare. Sarah moved about efficiently, but I could sense subtle shifts in her behavior. Small pauses, a lighter tone, and occasional glances that betrayed awareness of my presence. I recognized that influence, once cultivated patiently, begins to show in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. My goal was not confrontation, but quiet acknowledgement, a reclaiming of space that had been subtly denied to me for too long. During Saturday morning, Daniel and I shared a cup of coffee in the sunlit kitchen. Conversation was natural, flowing from small talk to reflections on family memories. He laughed at anecdotes I shared from his childhood, the same stories Sarah had often glossed over or dismissed in her meticulous hosting. These moments reinforced the enduring bond between parent and child, a connection that had persisted despite attempts to minimize or exclude me. I noticed that Daniel's attentiveness had shifted. He now sought my input more frequently, casually asking for my opinion on small household matters. It was subtle, but it reflected a restoration of respect, a recognition that my presence carried value beyond mere formality or obligation. Later that morning, Sarah invited me into the living room under the pretext of organizing the guest space. I agreed, approaching the request with cautious cooperation. As we moved furniture and folded linens together, I noted her attention to detail and her careful orchestration of tasks. Yet beneath the surface there was an undercurrent of acknowledgement, an implicit recognition that I belonged in the household dynamics. I maintained a neutral demeanor, offering guidance only when necessary and allowing Sarah to take the lead in her usual style. The interaction was delicate, a balance between asserting presence and respecting her sense of control. I realized that influence is often best exercised through measured participation rather than overt authority. That afternoon, a neighbor dropped by with a small gift basket of fresh fruit. I greeted her warmly, allowing Sarah to step aside and witness a natural moment of interaction without interference. The neighbor, unaware of the previous tensions within the household, commented on the welcoming atmosphere and the sense of warmth that seemed to emanate from the home. Sarah's eyes flickered toward me, betraying a moment of reflection, perhaps recognition of the subtle ways influence and presence are established. I noted this observation carefully, understanding that consistent, calm engagement fosters recognition over time. It reinforced my belief that acknowledgement need not be demanded. It can be cultivated through patience, consistency, and grace. As the afternoon waned, I engaged in a quiet project in the garden. Planting marigolds and arranging small potted plants along the windowsill, I took solace in the tangible results of careful effort. Daniel wandered by, offering occasional encouragement and remarks about the beauty of the arrangement. These small interactions reminded me that presence, attention, and care are enduring forms of influence. Sarah, meanwhile, moved about with her tasks but allowed space for my independent engagement. The subtle equilibrium was emerging. My presence was neither hidden nor imposed, and the household dynamic was adjusting to accommodate recognition of my enduring role. It was a quiet reclamation, achieved through patience and consistent contribution rather than confrontation. As evening approached, the aroma of dinner filled the house. I observed Sarah preparing the final touches, offering small, polite suggestions when asked. Her movements remained deliberate, but her tone was slightly less rigid, less rehearsed. The subtle shift indicated that my steady presence and measured engagement were having a cumulative effect. Daniel expressed appreciation for my assistance, reinforcing acknowledgement without creating conflict. I found satisfaction in the quiet influence I was exerting, understanding that lasting respect is often cultivated through calm consistency rather than dramatic gestures. The balance of the household, while not entirely shifted, had begun to reflect subtle acknowledgement of my role. Dinner that night proceeded with the guests, whose arrival I had anticipated with quiet preparation. I moved about the periphery, offering warm greetings and occasional engagement in conversation. Sarah maintained her hosting composure, but small adjustments in her demeanor suggested a growing awareness of my presence. Daniel included me in discussions, soliciting opinions and memories, weaving me naturally into the dialogue. The guests seemed unaware of the underlying tensions and the subtle dynamics, allowing the interactions to appear seamless and natural. I recognized that influence, when exercised patiently and thoughtfully, often manifests in subtle acknowledgement rather than overt recognition. After the guests departed, I assisted Sarah with cleanup, maintaining a balance of engagement without asserting authority. I noted her expressions, brief moments of relaxation, a softening of demeanor that indicated a subtle shift in household dynamics. Daniel moved about with ease, occasionally consulting me on small matters, reinforcing acknowledgement and respect. I reflected on the progression, understanding that influence and presence are cumulative, often established in quiet, consistent acts rather than singular, dramatic moments. The household, once marked by subtle exclusion, was beginning to reflect a more balanced dynamic, acknowledging my enduring presence through the measured response of others. Late that night, I retired to my room, opening my notebook to record observations from the day. Writing allowed me to structure reflection, transform complex emotions into clarity, and identify opportunities for further engagement. I noted Sarah's subtle acknowledgement, Daniel's renewed attentiveness, and the ways in which consistent presence fosters recognition over time. The act of writing reinforced my understanding of influence as a process, a gradual, thoughtful cultivation, rather than abrupt assertion. Each entry strengthened my resolve to continue exercising patient engagement, shaping the household dynamic through consistent, subtle action that encouraged acknowledgement without confrontation. By Sunday, I observed that small changes had become more evident. Sarah's movements were less rigid, and moments of ease with me appeared intermittently. Daniel's attentiveness and casual inclusion reinforced acknowledgement, suggesting a gradual recalibration of household dynamics. I reflected on the lessons of the week. Influence, respect, and recognition are cultivated through patience, observation, and thoughtful participation. The experience reinforced my belief that meaningful presence is established not through drama or confrontation, but through consistent, intentional action that quietly asserts value, dignity, and enduring connection. Sunday afternoon settled with a quiet sense of accomplishment, the kind that comes after observing subtle shifts in behavior over time. I moved through the kitchen, preparing a light lunch, taking care to place small touches that invited warmth and connection. Daniel lingered nearby, asking about the history of certain recipes, curious about nuances I had perfected over decades. Each question, though casual, carried a weight of recognition that had been absent in prior weeks. Sarah hovered in the doorway at one point, fidgeting slightly with a dish towel, and I noticed her glance toward me less a scrutiny and more a fleeting acknowledgement. The small, almost imperceptible change brought a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing influence could be re-established without confrontation or force. After lunch, I suggested a casual walk around the neighborhood, inviting Daniel along. He accepted immediately, showing enthusiasm and curiosity, while Sarah remained inside, absorbed in chores. The air was warm, the sun soft, and each step carried the unspoken history of countless walks I had shared with Daniel when he was young. Conversation flowed naturally, moving from school to memories of his father, to quiet reflections about the home. I noted the way he responded to stories now, with more openness, more attentiveness, a sign that subtle shifts in household dynamics were embedding themselves into everyday interaction. The walk became not only a shared moment of bonding, but also a soft assertion of the enduring maternal influence. When we returned, Sarah had begun preparing a small garden patch outside. I joined her without imposing guidance, allowing her to lead while contributing quietly with precise, thoughtful gestures. We planted flowers together, the soil moist and rich beneath our hands, a tactile reminder of growth and patience. Daniel wandered back and forth, occasionally pointing out weeds or offering to fetch water, engaging in the project as a natural part of the family rhythm. I observed Sarah's small adjustments, her tone less rigid, her movements less constrained. She had begun to understand that my presence was not a threat, but a stabilizing force within the household, a subtle reclamation achieved through consistent, measured engagement. By mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. A friend of Sarah's had arrived early, catching us mid-garden, and I felt the familiar stir of tension. Sarah froze, subtly signaling for me to retreat. For a moment, I considered stepping back quietly, respecting the dynamics she had attempted to impose, yet I realized that the narrative I was shaping required subtle persistence. I offered a polite greeting to the guest, smiling warmly, maintaining composure without intrusion. The visitor responded naturally, unaware of past tensions, and the interaction became a seamless integration of my presence. Sarah's expression flickered an acknowledgement of my ability to assert presence with grace without undermining her or the situation. After the guest departed, Sarah sighed, adjusting the sleeves of her blouse and leaning against the counter. I approached gently, commenting on the beauty of the flowers we had planted together. She nodded, responding with a faint smile, a small concession to the patience I had exercised in re-establishing my presence. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet amusement, recognizing the subtle shifts and the delicate balance between maternal authority and daughter-in-law dynamics. The household, once marked by exclusion and hidden movements, was beginning to reflect a new equilibrium, one that honored history, contribution, and the inherent value of my presence. Later that afternoon, I engaged in a small project inside the home, organizing old photographs and keepsakes, allowing the memories to flow naturally. Daniel wandered in, curious about the images, and asked questions that indicated genuine interest in family history, including details Sarah had neglected or dismissed in prior conversations. I noted the warmth in his tone, the casual inclusion of me in shared narrative, and the gentle acknowledgement of my enduring role. Sarah observed silently from the background, subtly adjusting her approach to accommodate recognition without direct concession. The interactions illustrated a gradual, deliberate shift in household dynamics, achieved through patience, consistent contribution, and quiet assertion. As evening approached, I prepared dinner with a focus on engagement rather than oversight. Daniel assisted enthusiastically, asking questions and seeking guidance in the preparation, creating natural opportunities for connection. Sarah moved about the kitchen, her movements less tense, occasionally sharing a laugh or remark. The atmosphere, once charged with subtle tension and exclusion, now carried a sense of shared purpose and acknowledgement. I reflected on the transformation, understanding that influence and recognition are cumulative, reinforced through everyday engagement, quiet observation, and consistent presence rather than confrontation or dramatic gestures. After dinner, I suggested a brief family activity, a card game Daniel and I had played during his childhood. Sarah hesitated, glancing between us, and then agreed with a faint nod. The game proceeded with laughter, teasing, and gentle competition, creating natural moments of bonding. Daniel sought guidance and recollection from me, his attentiveness reflecting renewed respect and acknowledgement of our shared history. Sarah, while initially hesitant, became more engaged as the game progressed, revealing subtle enjoyment and relaxation. The evening underscored the power of calm persistence, shared experiences, and thoughtful inclusion in rebuilding trust, recognition, and familial dynamics. Late that night, I retreated to my room, opening my notebook to document the day's observations. Writing reinforced clarity, reflection, and strategy, transforming emotion into measured insight. I noted the subtle acknowledgement of my presence, Daniel's renewed attentiveness, and Sarah's gradual accommodation of my enduring role. Each recorded observation strengthened the understanding that influence is cultivated through consistency, patience, and intentional engagement rather than confrontation or demand. The quiet reclamation of household space and recognition was unfolding organically, illustrating the long-term value of measured, thoughtful action in reasserting presence and authority. Before bed, I paused to reflect by the window, observing the calm settling over the neighborhood. I realized that progress, while subtle, had been significant. Sarah had begun to adjust her behavior. Daniel had renewed attentiveness, and the household atmosphere had shifted from quiet tension to balanced acknowledgement. The moments of connection, shared activity, and thoughtful observation reinforced my enduring influence and the subtle reclamation of respect. The day had demonstrated that patience, presence, and deliberate engagement cultivate lasting recognition and acknowledgement, restoring equilibrium and reinforcing familial bonds without confrontation. The next morning arrived with a gentle, almost imperceptible shift in the air. I moved through the house with the quiet confidence of someone who had observed, adapted, and persisted. Breakfast was simple but intentional: a warm oatmeal with fruit, toast freshly baked, and tea steeped just right. Daniel lingered at the table, savoring the conversation and the subtle attention to detail I had always brought to our shared meals. Sarah, unusually quiet, moved about the kitchen preparing her coffee, glancing at us with a mix of curiosity and tentative acknowledgement. Her subtle glances no longer carried judgment but a hint of respect, small signs that the steady presence I maintained was gradually altering household dynamics. After breakfast, I suggested we take a small walk around the block, offering a gentle invitation rather than a directive. Daniel eagerly accepted, the bond between parent and child visible in his ease and willingness to share moments of reflection. Sarah remained behind, absorbed in chores, leaving us a window of uninterrupted conversation. As we walked, I spoke softly of memories, of moments long past yet vivid in our shared history. Daniel responded with attentiveness and genuine curiosity, asking questions about traditions, family stories, and his father's peculiar habits. The dialogue was effortless, revealing a subtle restoration of trust, acknowledgement, and emotional connection that had been eroded by prior exclusion and hidden behavior. Returning home, we found Sarah preparing a small garden area near the patio. I joined her, offering quiet assistance, careful not to overshadow her efforts. We planted flowers side by side, the soil warm beneath our fingers, a tactile reminder of growth, patience, and cooperation. Daniel wandered back and forth, occasionally pointing out weeds or offering to fetch water, engaging naturally in the project. Sarah's movements, while still deliberate, carried a softer rhythm, less rigid and more collaborative. She seemed to understand, unconsciously perhaps, that my presence was neither intrusive nor threatening, but a steady influence that shaped the household dynamics with subtle, deliberate care. By mid-afternoon, a distant cousin arrived unexpectedly. Sarah, startled, whispered for me to stay out of sight. I paused at the edge of the patio, observing the interaction without interfering. I smiled warmly at our cousin as she entered, exchanging pleasantries and acknowledging shared history. The conversation flowed naturally, and Sarah noticed my presence without needing to invite confrontation. The subtle acknowledgement in her expression, half surprise, half recognition, demonstrated that influence could be asserted through calm composure and consistent engagement, even when temporarily hidden from direct view. I realized that patience and measured presence often wield more power than overt authority. After the cousin left, Sarah and I found ourselves in the living room, arranging small decorative touches. I offered gentle suggestions when appropriate, careful to maintain balance between assistance and autonomy. She responded with brief nods and occasional smiles, subtle signs that the household hierarchy was adapting to include recognition of my enduring role. Daniel observed silently from the doorway, occasionally interjecting with curiosity or questions, reinforcing acknowledgement and respect. These interactions highlighted the quiet power of patience, consistency, and thoughtful engagement elements that had allowed me to reclaim presence without confrontation or conflict. Late afternoon, I returned to my small indoor project of organizing family photos and keepsakes. Daniel followed, intrigued by the stories behind each image. He asked questions, laughed at shared memories, and reflected thoughtfully on past events. Sarah remained in the background, offering minimal input, but her subtle adjustments, pausing to look, adjusting posture, softening tone, demonstrated incremental recognition of my presence and influence. The room, once charged with unspoken tension, now resonated with calm acknowledgement, illustrating the cumulative effect of consistent, deliberate action over time. I understood that restoration of influence is often gradual, requiring patience, observation, and intentional engagement. As evening approached, I suggested a small cooking project, preparing dinner together in a casual, collaborative manner. Daniel engaged enthusiastically, asking questions, seeking guidance, and enjoying the process. Sarah, initially hesitant, gradually became more relaxed, her movements fluid and less rehearsed. The atmosphere shifted from subtle tension to one of shared effort and quiet recognition. The dinner itself was infused with warmth, conversation flowing naturally. Daniel sought my input on flavors and presentation, while Sarah offered small comments, reflecting acknowledgement of my enduring role without direct confrontation or conflict. The household balance was gradually reshaping itself through consistency, presence, and shared activity. After dinner, I proposed a card game, reminiscent of those we had played during Daniel's childhood. Sarah hesitated briefly but eventually agreed, signaling a small concession to shared engagement. The game unfolded with laughter, gentle teasing, and light competition. Daniel's attentiveness and inclusion of me in conversation demonstrated renewed respect and acknowledgement. Sarah, while initially hesitant, began participating with a sense of ease. The shared activity reinforced connection, subtly restoring household dynamics and affirming the influence of steady, patient engagement. The evening highlighted the power of calm persistence, shared experiences, and thoughtful inclusion in rebuilding trust and recognition. Late at night, I retreated to my room, opening my notebook to document observations and reflections from the day. Writing allowed me to organize emotions, clarify insights, and identify opportunities for continued engagement. I noted subtle acknowledgments from Sarah, renewed attentiveness from Daniel, and the quiet restoration of household equilibrium. Each entry reinforced the understanding that influence and recognition are cultivated through consistency, patience, and deliberate engagement, rather than confrontation or dramatic gestures. The quiet reclamation of presence was gradually solidifying, illustrating the enduring value of thoughtful action. Before bed, I paused by the window, observing the neighborhood bathed in soft moonlight. The day had demonstrated progress, subtle shifts in behavior, small acknowledgments, and renewed bonds. Sarah had begun adjusting her behavior, Daniel had embraced connection, and the household atmosphere had transitioned from tension to calm balance. Moments of shared experience, measured engagement, and quiet reflection reinforced my influence and presence. The subtle reclamation of respect and acknowledgement, achieved without confrontation, demonstrated the lasting power of patience, consistency, and thoughtful, deliberate action in restoring equilibrium within family dynamics. The next morning brought a quiet clarity, the kind that comes when patience and persistence have begun to bear fruit. I moved through the house with deliberate ease, noting small changes in the atmosphere, the way Sarah now lingered in the doorway without the old defensiveness, the way Daniel offered a smile before speaking, acknowledging my presence without hesitation. Breakfast was simple, but I made it intentional: warm tea, fresh bread, and lightly fried eggs, each element a subtle assertion of care and continuity. Daniel lingered, savoring the interaction, while Sarah moved about the kitchen, her movements more relaxed than before. The household had shifted imperceptibly, but unmistakably. Recognition and acknowledgement, once withheld, were now quietly integrating into the fabric of daily life. After breakfast, I suggested a short walk with Daniel, and he eagerly accepted. Sarah declined, citing chores, but I noticed no tension in her voice, only a quiet acknowledgement that our time together was not a threat to her role. As we walked, Daniel and I shared memories of his childhood, of his father, of family moments both joyous and bittersweet. He asked questions that revealed curiosity, engagement, and a desire to reconnect with the history he had once overlooked. I listened, answered, and added reflections without judgment, guiding the conversation gently, letting the bond between mother and son reinforce itself naturally. Each word, each story, became a thread weaving us back together. Upon returning, we found Sarah in the garden, tending to the flowers we had planted days before. I joined her quietly, offering small, thoughtful gestures of assistance rather than direct instruction. Together, we nurtured the plants, feeling the soil beneath our fingers, sharing brief, quiet exchanges. Daniel wandered between us, offering to water the beds or remove weeds, participating without prompting. The atmosphere, once tense and exclusionary, now carried a rhythm of quiet cooperation. Sarah's earlier gestures of concealment had diminished, replaced by subtle acknowledgement of my presence and influence. The household was shifting toward balance, guided not by confrontation but by consistent, deliberate engagement. By mid-afternoon, a neighbor arrived unexpectedly, curious about the garden. Sarah tensed momentarily but quickly composed herself, introducing me with a small nod of respect. I smiled warmly, welcoming the neighbor, maintaining composure without intrusion. The conversation flowed naturally, demonstrating that presence can be asserted gently yet firmly, shaping perception without overt assertion. Daniel observed, quietly absorbing the subtle power of calm confidence. Sarah, while still cautious, seemed to recognize that influence was not about dominance, but about consistency, patience, and quiet authority. The brief visit illustrated how behavior and recognition shift gradually when met with steadfast presence rather than confrontation. Later, we returned inside, and I suggested a shared indoor activity organizing old photographs and memorabilia. Daniel followed, intrigued by the images and stories they contained. He asked questions that showed genuine interest, laughing at shared anecdotes and reflecting thoughtfully on family history. Sarah observed from the background, offering minimal commentary, yet her posture and softened expression revealed growing acknowledgement of my role. The room, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter, infused with shared purpose and subtle recognition. The process reminded me that influence is often cumulative, established through patient engagement and thoughtful presence rather than confrontation or assertion. As evening approached, I proposed preparing dinner together, turning it into a collaborative experience. Daniel eagerly participated, asking for guidance and contributing to each step. Sarah initially hesitated, but gradually became more relaxed, joining the activity in a quieter, more cooperative manner. The dinner itself was imbued with warmth and connection, conversation flowing naturally. Daniel sought my input on flavors and presentation, while Sarah made small comments and shared laughs. The household balance, previously marked by tension and exclusion, now shifted toward shared purpose and subtle acknowledgement of my enduring role. These moments reinforced the power of measured engagement in reclaiming presence and influence. After dinner, I suggested a card game Daniel and I had played during his childhood. Sarah hesitated but eventually agreed, signaling a small concession. The game progressed with gentle teasing, laughter, and friendly competition. Daniel's attentiveness reflected renewed respect, while Sarah became increasingly engaged, revealing the early stages of enjoyment and connection. The evening illustrated how shared experiences can rebuild bonds and restore recognition, gradually shifting household dynamics toward balance and acknowledgement. Each moment of connection was a step in the subtle reclamation of influence and respect. Later that night, I retreated to my room, opening my notebook to document observations and reflections. Writing allowed me to capture subtle shifts, emotional nuances, and opportunities for continued engagement. I noted Daniel's growing attentiveness, Sarah's tentative acknowledgement, and the household's evolving atmosphere. The quiet reclamation of space, presence, and authority was steadily taking hold. Each observation reinforced the importance of patience, consistency, and intentional engagement in restoring influence and balance within the household. The day's interactions had underscored that authority and respect often grow quietly, reinforced by steady, thoughtful action. Before bed, I paused by the window, observing the neighborhood bathed in soft moonlight. The day had demonstrated progress, small acknowledgements, renewed attentiveness, and subtle shifts in dynamics that hinted at lasting change. Sarah's behavior was more accommodating, Daniel more engaged, and the household atmosphere calmer and more balanced. Moments of shared experience, measured engagement, and thoughtful reflection reinforced my presence and influence. The reclamation of respect and recognition, achieved without confrontation, illustrated the enduring power of patience and deliberate, consistent action. Quiet persistence, I realized, could achieve more than force ever could. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the journey so far. The road had been long, marked by subtle tension, exclusion, and hidden motives. Yet through careful observation, measured engagement, and deliberate patience, The household had begun to transform. Recognition, once withheld, was gradually returning. Influence, once challenged, was being reasserted through consistent, thoughtful action. The journey was far from over, but the foundations were solid, and the future held the promise of restored balance, respect, and acknowledgement. In the quiet of the night, I felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that perseverance and wisdom could reclaim what had once been threatened.